Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, July 17th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Maine and the White House having private conversations about a backup for Susan Collins in the event she opts not to run in the 2026 United States Senate race. Now, Susan Collins has been very adamant since her last election victory that she intends to run for re-election in the 2026 race. But it is always interesting when a White House, especially a Republican administration, talking about a Republican senator who's been serving for decades in the state of Maine about the possibility of a backup, citing that there might be a better option in this state. And while the White House isn't talking about primarying Susan Collins, they know they wouldn't get that far in a state like that, they do know that Susan Collins is not the type of Republican that they want in this state, and it also might indicate there isn't going to be as much support from the Oval Office or the MAGA side of the Republican Party for Susan Collins as she might need in the 2026 midterm elections. Now, Donald Trump, too, also floating this idea that Susan Collins might not run, feels a bit reminiscent of the state of North Carolina when Senator Thom Tillis, who actually did launch a formal re-election, when Donald Trump floated very early on that if Tillis decides not to run, there should be a viable alternative. To which he eventually got to the point of saying, even if Tillis is running, as he says he's going to run, there still should be an alternative who's elected to the Republican primary. And just one day after Donald Trump went on a full tirade against Thom Tillis on Truth Social, Thom Tillis decided to drop out of the race and instead decided to seek retirement, opening up this primary for Laura Trump, the daughter-in-law of Donald Trump himself, who was already leading Thom Tillis in hypothetical head-to-head matchups in this state. And so while it never is a guarantee that what Donald Trump says is reality, and we know that to be true in many instances, especially electoral politics, it does always find me to be interested by the fact that any type of major Republican player, much less the President of the United States, even hinting that one of their incumbents might not run again, is always a cause for concern, especially for the Republican Party. Now, the thing about Maine right now is that Democrats are the ones who are actually absent. They are the ones that have difficulty finding a candidate running for office in this state. And it makes sense. The last election didn't go so well for Democrats in Maine. Sarah Gideon, who was the Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, was leading in every single poll, had out-fundraised Susan Collins, outspent Susan Collins, and was running on the same ballot that Donald Trump won across the state by a massive, well, not massive, but bigger than Hillary Clinton, about 7 points better, 9 points across the state. Clinton won the state by about 1.5 points. And so they're by about 3. But looking at Susan Collins, who did have a massive outperformance of Donald Trump, won by a margin of roughly 9.6 or 8.6%, roughly 9 points across the state. But the thing that I think is lost on a lot of Democrats in this state is what happens if you actually go through what it was expected in terms of the ranked choice voting tabulation. Now, I know this is a bit convoluted, and it seems like we're grasping for straws here, but bear with me because I think there is a point to be made about it. Susan Collins in the first round cleared the 50% mark, which means that the rest of these candidates here didn't need to end up going through the multiple rounds of voting, that their votes could be reallocated amongst the remainder of the candidates. Susan Collins won, yes, by 8.9% or 8.6%. But when you take a look at what the data tells us about where you were with Lisa Savage and Max Linn, chances are that there would have been more votes going to Sarah Gideon than we expect. Well, Max Linn was definitely more extreme, and if you watched those Senate debates, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I watched every single one of them. But what is interesting is that Lisa Savage actually was initially running as the Green Party candidate. She ran on the ballot, switched to be an independent right before the election, but was absolutely actually to the left of Sarah Gideon. And Lisa Savage even went so far as to indicate that her supporters should be ranking Sarah Gideon over Susan Collins, that there should be a clear second choice. That's the whole point of ranked choice voting. And so assuming that her supporters had followed through, the map actually would have ended up, I'm sure a lot of Max Linn's support would have gone to Susan Collins. He ran to the right of everybody on that debate stage. But we would have ended up, hypothetically speaking, with a map here that was actually a bit more advantageous to Democrats than they might think. We would have seen Susan Collins with roughly 52.6% of the vote, and we would have seen Sarah Gideon with roughly 47.4% of the vote. A 5-point loss doesn't look that much daunting in comparison to a 9-point loss across the state. And so thinking about 2026, I think the big reason why Donald Trump is floating this idea that Susan Collins might not run is simply because Collins, very obviously, is not happy with where Donald Trump is. didn't vote for the big, beautiful bill, and has not formally launched a re-election. And Democrats have an opening here. The Democrats know Susan Collins is weak, and somebody who's been serving in elected office for as long as she has, this would be a very bad way to go out. Yes, you're leaving it out, and I don't think any other Trump-style candidate could win across the state of Maine. But we've seen Donald Trump endorse Republicans across many battleground states. In fact, non-battleground states, in the hopes and expectation that they would actually win. I remember that back in 2022 in the Senate race, we saw Don Bolduc being nominated by Donald Trump's endorsement against an actual, longer-term serving Republican in this state. We saw that who was eliminated in the primary, Chuck Morse, who was the president of the New Hampshire Senate, and at a time was actually former acting governor, Don Bolduc, received a lot of support from the MAGA wing. And by the time you reached the general, he was already getting full-fledged endorsements from Donald Trump, and you saw, what did that do? It made him lose by roughly 10 points across the state, right? And so what Democrats are looking to 2026 is their best bet right now, based off everyone who has said, I'm not running. The only person they could potentially pull into the race that they think could do quite well across it is Janet Mills, who's currently the governor of Maine. Now, the electoral history here starts in 2018. Janet Mills was elected to be governor against Sean Moody, won by about 7 points. But Democrats were quite worried about the next cycle. 2022 was shaping up to be a much less favorable year for Democrats than 2018 was, and they had won this race by roughly 7. And the former Republican governor, Paul LePage, who was term limited out of running in 2018, there's a caveat in the Constitution, if you just wait a term, you can run again, decided he was running again in 2022. He had won in 2010, he had won in 2014, and at that point, by about 5 points across the state. And Republicans and Democrats thought that in 2022 he might be able to do it again. But Janet Mills showed a level of electability that really shows why Democrats really want her to run for Senate in 2026. Just the big caveat here for Janet Mills is that she's 78 years old and would likely only serve one full term. But anything for Democrats is better than having Susan Collins in the Senate again. The Democratic primary, again, is not a competitive one. You have a former deputy secretary of my home state's Department of the Environment, Maryland's Department of the Environment, and you have the former chief of staff to U.S. Representative Katie Porter. Outside of that, major candidates have said no. They've either declined or instead they're running for governor across the state. They're deciding that instead of running for Senate, they're going to put themselves out there for the governorship. While that may be the decision that is best for them, I'm not going to be the person who makes a decision on whether or not someone should or should not be running for elected office. I do believe that there are many calls on a lot of Democrats across the state to run in this, race because they do believe there is a viable opportunity here. And I think this fracture, even within the White House, shows exactly why that exists. The MAGA base doesn't like Susan Collins, and neither do the Democrats. Her approval rating is some of the lowest that we have seen for any sitting U.S. senator. Even Republicans on her side largely disapprove of her more than they approve. Her approval rating is in the low 20s at this point. And even back in 2020, her approval rating in exit polls of those who actually voted was about 49%. So to see that today, polling at a high point of 35 and a low point of 14, you can start to see why Republicans are worried about Maine, looking for alternatives, and why Democrats see it as an opportunity in the 2026 race. And while it may not happen, Susan Collins may end up running against a no-name Democrat, and no one actually puts themselves forward to run against Susan Collins and takes that risk, seeing the last election being fearful about what this one might bring. The race itself is going to be competitive no matter what, and Democrats have a very clear shot at winning in this state. If Janet Mills runs, I do believe she is the favorite in Maine today, and my election maps have had Maine as a Republican state for quite some time. I do believe that it is on the cusp of having a Democrat run in this race that could actually win, but a lot of it really has been asking Democrats across the state, will you run? I mean, just taking a look at who's running for governor too, it is quite laughable because when you see who's running, you'll see, why aren't you running for Senate? Only one of you can be governor. Who do we have? The Maine Secretary of State, the former president of the Maine Senate, Angus King III, who is the son of, yes, the other U.S. Senator, Angus King, who also was the governor. Hannah Pingree, does her name ring a bell? At least the last name might, if you know Maine politics. The daughter of U.S. Representative for Maine's 1st District, Shelley Pingree. And also former Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives. A lot of these names here are recognizable, are electable, and would be formidable in the 2026 midterms against Susan Collins. But the big question is, do they even decide to go for it? We don't know. They might not. They may. But right now, this race is left to be fought to no degree. And while the White House has these private conversations about a backup, maybe they think that a big name Democrat is going to run and scare Susan Collins out of the race, or they just really don't like Susan Collins and think it's right to have a better option and a viable alternative to who's currently in the U.S. Senate. It doesn't seem like anybody is happy with Susan Collins at this point, which is exactly why she is the most vulnerable at this point, which is exactly why it is now the Democrats could meet the moment and say, Susan Collins, people don't want you to be in the Senate from either side of the aisle. We're going to run the governor who holds a high favorability rating across the state, might I add, significantly higher than Susan Collins. One is actually in the positive, and Susan Collins is in the very, very, very low negatives. Again, one of the most unpopular senators across the country, and yet nobody wants to challenge her. And while I do think Susan Collins has appeal, in this day and age of hyperpolarization, I'm not thoroughly convinced that it exists as much as it used to. This is not 1996 when she decided to run in the first place. We are 30 years later. She's not in the same position she was, and Maine is not the same demographic in terms of electoral composition that it was. Split ticket voting, voters were open to it a very long time ago. They were, even as up until the Trump age. And then it all went downhill. Maine is a good example of how it could go downhill for Susan Collins. The question is, does she run? And the question is, does she win? Right now, I'd say yes to both. But with the right Democrat in this state, and this is a necessary one if Democrats want to win back the majority in the Senate by the end of the decade, Maine could go blue. It could go blue with Janet Mills, and it could go blue with one of the other Democrats that I listed who are running for governor right now. You just need somebody who's willing to actually run this race seriously. And you might find that, but you also might not. It's to be interesting to see that the White House certainly sees Susan Collins as vulnerable and potentially unwilling to run for re-election, maybe out of fear that she loses her race. And that in itself is noteworthy because it confirms everything we've known thus far, which is that the Republican Party knows Susan Collins might be on her way out, and Susan Collins herself might know that too. The question is, does she do it by choice, or does she get forced out by the voters in November of 2026? So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.